Hey guys, tonight we drift across a wide open plain where the grass barely moves, as if it's politely trying not to disturb you. The air is warm, the sky is pulling soft shades of lavender over itself, and far ahead you can almost make out the silhouettes of armies who once stood here. Armies preparing for moments so dramatic that you probably wouldn't survive this part of the story awake. But don't worry, you're just floating above it all, watching from a safe, sleep-friendly distance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drift a little closer to the quiet horizon, where ancient warriors once gathered, their armor clinking softly like someone sorting spoons in the next room. You're not here for the chaos, you're here for the strangely poetic ends, those final moments that history recorded in surprisingly gentle tones. And the first thing you notice as you hover over the field is how still everything feels now. It's hard to imagine that this calm space once echoed with the stomping of horses, the creak of shields, and the very dramatic last words of people who had absolutely no idea they'd be remembered thousands of years later. Take the story of King Leonidas, for example, a mainstream historical fact. He and his 300 Spartans held the pass at Thermopylae, a heroic stand that still makes modern gym-goers feel strangely guilty about skipping leg day. You imagine him here, steady, stoic, incredibly good at looking intimidating in a breeze. But as you float near the edges of this memory, you don't see the clash itself. Instead, you sense the quiet after it was over, when the sea wind crept back in and brushed over the shields left behind. It's oddly peaceful, almost too peaceful for what was essentially history's most intense "you shall not pass." But then your attention drifts to a lesser-known, quirkier tale, one of the earliest recorded death by turtle. Yes, you hear that correctly. Ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus, according to some versions, might have met his end when an eagle dropped a turtle on his bald head, mistaking it for a rock. Historians still argue whether this actually happened or if it's just ancient gossip that got way out of hand. But as you watch a sleepy bird glide overhead in this historical haze, you can't help thinking, that would make for a very confusing obituary. You drift across another corner of the plain, and suddenly you're near the memory of the warrior poet Achilles, not the Hollywood version with suspiciously perfect hair, but the mythic one whose heel has caused more debates than pineapple on pizza. You don't see the arrow, you just feel the atmosphere shift into something reflective, like the world trying to remember exactly what happened. Historians still argue whether the real Achilles was a single figure or a fusion of many heroic tales stitched into one, a kind of ancient cinematic universe without the need for post-credit scenes. What remains, though, is that his supposed final moment has inspired countless metaphors for vulnerability. You can almost hear ancient storytellers whispering, "Don't get too confident about your ankles, just saying." Soft wind brushes past you, and the scenery changes. Now you're standing, drifting, beside a Roman legionary's camp. A simple wooden stake marks the memory of one soldier whose epic end wasn't from sword or spear, but from overeating figs. Really? A quirky little tidbit. It's said that Emperor Augustus favored figs so much that one story involved someone poisoning him through them, though historians still argue whether that's entirely true or just high-level fruit slander. But plenty of Romans really did overindulge in figs, wine, and cheese in ways that probably should have come with ancient nutrition labels. You picture one soldier leaning back after too many bites, whispering, worth it, before history gently turned him into a lesson in moderation. As you drift farther, you sense the memory of Hua Mulan, not the singing, dancing version, but the figure from the ancient ballad of Mulan, whose death is actually not recorded at all. Some sources imply she returned home peacefully. Others suggest she chose a more somber path when pressed back into service. Historians still argue which ending is closer to truth, and you hover here between possibilities. The uncertainty has a dreamlike softness to it. What mattered most was her quiet bravery, something that doesn't fade even in this hushed landscape. You watch the mist fold neatly around her legend like a blanket being tucked in. Nearby, you come across the echo of the Celtic queen Boudica, who led a fiery revolt against Rome, but whose final moments are described in ways that feel suspiciously vague. Some say she drank poison, others say illness took her. Historians still argue whether she even existed exactly as described, or whether she was a composite symbol of resistance, ancient propaganda carved into human form. But here, in the soft twilight, you sense her presence not as a warrior screaming into battle, but as someone quietly stepping back into the mist. Her story still alive, but her ending gently blurred. A faint rustle draws your attention to the ridge, where the ghostly image of a samurai sits on his heels, staring at a distant horizon. You don't see steel or blood, you just see a figure honoring a code so deeply rooted that his final breath feels like part of the landscape. A mainstream fact, samurai followed Bushido, a moral code emphasizing honor, loyalty, and self-discipline. But a lesser-known tidbit, some samurai wrote death poems before their final moments, short, serene reflections on the inevitability of departure. A few of these poems are surprisingly funny, like ancient versions of, "Welp, it's been real." You imagine one drifting on the breeze, something like, "My sword is sharp, but not as sharp as deadlines." As you float over the quiet scene, you sense how many endings were shaped not by violence, but by meaning, by the stories other people told afterward, reshaping the final moments until they were less about fear and more about legacy. You let that awareness settle in like a warm blanket across your shoulders. The landscape around you softens, the warriors fade, the camps vanish, and the wind becomes the soft hush of your own breathing. You're not here for the clashing of shields. You're here for the quiet that follows, the way history settles the dust and smooths the sharp edges until even the most epic departures feel like gentle goodbyes. You drift onward from the quiet plains, letting the soft hum of history guide you toward a different kind of landscape, one filled not with armor or war banners, but with scrawls, ink pots, and a whole lot of people who spent their lives thinking very hard about extremely complicated things. Philosophers, the ones who could debate ethics, logic, and the meaning of the universe for hours, but somehow, in the final moments of their lives, managed to leave behind endings that range from poetic to awkward to, "Oh no, not like that." You step into this calmer space the way you might walk into a library at night, light-footed, curious, and maybe a little relieved that nothing sharp or pointy is being waved around. Here, the air smells faintly of papyrus, dust, and that sweet mix of wisdom and mild social awkwardness that philosophers across the ages seem to share. Right away, your attention falls on Pythagoras. Yes, that Pythagoras, the triangle guy. A mainstream fact, he founded a philosophical community that believed in immortality of the soul, reincarnation, and the mathematical harmony of the universe. But here's the quirky bit. One legend claims that he met his end because he refused to walk through a field of beans. Beans! According to certain ancient sources, his enemies chased him, and he reached a bean field but refused to step into it because beans were considered sacred or impure, depending on the interpretation. Historians still argue whether this was a symbolic story, a smear campaign by rivals, or just ancient comedians having a really good time. You picture him standing there, breathing hard, looking at a patch of innocent legumes and thinking, "Not today." It's one of those moments where you can't help but whisper a sleepy, "Same, honestly." You drift past Pythagoras and into the presence of another mind, Heraclitus, the philosopher famous for saying you can't step into the same river twice. You watch him scribbling by lamplight, the glow warm and soft. A mainstream fact, he believed the world was in constant flux. But his end? A quirky little debate. Some ancient accounts say he died after covering himself in cow manure to cure an illness. Others say he tried to dry himself in the sun and basically overheated like a forgotten smartphone. Historians still argue whether either version is true or whether his rivals simply had an extremely strange sense of humor. Either way, you drift by with gentle sympathy for a man who probably deserved a much less pungent legacy. A breeze moves past you, and suddenly you're standing beside the memory of Socrates, the OG contrarian, the guy who could take your simple question about lunch and turn it into a 4-hour dialogue on the meaning of choice. Unlike the others, Socrates' exit is painfully well documented, a mainstream historical fact. He was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock after being accused of corrupting Athenian youth and disrespecting the gods. But in this dream-soft retelling, you don't see a courtroom, you don't see tension, you see a calm old man sitting cross-legged discussing justice with more chill than most people bring to ordering coffee. Even here, though, a quirky detail floats through. Some ancient writers recorded that his last request was for someone to sacrifice a rooster on his behalf, a gesture scholars still puzzle over. Historians still argue whether it was symbolic, sarcastic, or Socrates' version of an inside joke. You watch him fade from view, leaving behind only a ripple of gentle, stubborn wisdom. Just beyond him, you sense a ripple of laughter, dry, amused, bordering on the very modern. And there sits Diogenes. If philosophers had a most likely to be chaotic neutral award, he would win every year. A mainstream fact, he was a cynic philosopher who famously lived in a large ceramic jar and rejected social norms with almost theatrical gusto. As you drift closer, you spot the memory of him holding a lamp in daylight, searching for an honest man. Very on brand. His ending? You won't be surprised to learn it is confusing, contradictory, and weirdly funny. Some ancient sources say he died after holding his breath just to prove he could. Others say he ate raw octopus and regretted that life choice immediately. And still others claim he was bitten by a dog, which feels like cosmic payback considering how often he called people dogs. Historians still argue which version, if any, has merit. But you can almost hear Diogenes muttering, "Say whatever you want, just spell my name right." You drift deeper into this philosophical dreamscape and encounter Hypatia of Alexandria, mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher whose real death was anything but peaceful. A mainstream fact, she was murdered during a political religious conflict in 5th century Alexandria. But because this space is meant for rest, you don't relive that violence. You only see her walking through the library's columns, scroll in hand, her mind bright and steady. The quirky tidbit here? She was known to carry a small astrolabe and once reportedly used geometry to diffuse an awkward romantic situation, a move historians still admire. And yes, scholars still argue whether later writers exaggerated parts of her life for political narratives. You watch her fade into a soft glow, leaving behind a calm, dignified presence that feels like a lantern in the dark. Now you find yourself beside Zeno of Elea, the man behind paradoxes like Achilles versus the tortoise. A mainstream fact, He loved exposing logical contradictions. But his end is tangled in stories so dramatic they feel like ancient soap opera episodes. In one version, he bit a tyrant's ear. In another, he swallowed his own tongue to avoid revealing secrets. Historians still argue whether any of these colorful endings are true or just political theater. But as you hover here, Zeno sits peacefully, tapping his fingers together, probably crafting one more paradox just to make sure future generations would be very confused during math class. You drift toward a quieter corner of this space, where an elderly man sits scribbling calmly. This is Chrysippus, the Stoic philosopher. A mainstream fact, he helped shape Stoicism into the school we know today. But the quirky part? According to legend, he laughed himself to death. The story goes that he watched a donkey eat figs and joked that someone should give the donkey wine to wash him down. Then he keeled over, victim of his own punchline. Historians still argue whether this was an exaggerated anecdote added later, but you can almost feel him chuckling in the distance. As you float away from these thinkers, you notice how strangely comforting their presence is. People who spent their whole lives asking enormous questions, yet left the world in ways that were odd, fragile, human. They weren't symbols, they weren't statues, they were people trying to understand existence, and sometimes failing spectacularly at staying alive in the process. You take one more slow breath. The space around you quiets, the scrolls fade, the lamps dim, and you drift forward toward the next strange, gentle corner of history waiting just ahead. You drift forward into a softer, more ornate part of the historical landscape, where the ground beneath you shifts from dusty paths to smooth marble floors. The air seems a little perfumed now, floral, sweet, with a hint of incense that lingers like a whispered reminder that you've stepped into the world of royalty. Not the booming, triumphant version from movies, but the quieter, more human version, where kings and queens often slipped away in ways that would make you blink and think, wait, seriously? That's how it ended? You ease into a grand hall that looks like it has been polished by centuries of silence. Golden torches glow faintly on the walls, but not too bright, just enough to cast gentle highlights on the mosaics. You pass your fingers along the cool stone, and although you know you're only drifting through a memory, the texture feels oddly real, like the world wants you to slow down and take your time. Your first companion here is Cleopatra, not the overly dramatic snake bracelet version from Hollywood, but the real person who ruled Egypt with political brilliance far sharper than any eyeliner wing. A mainstream fact, Cleopatra aligned with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony to protect Egypt's independence. But her ending? That's where the quiet mysteries begin. The narrative goes that she ended her life by letting a venomous asp bite her, but historians still argue whether that's true or whether Roman propaganda shaped the story. Some suggest poison, carefully concealed. Others say an asp wouldn't have behaved the way the story describes. And you, floating nearby, sense none of the drama, only the stillness of her private chamber, and the silent dignity in a ruler choosing not to be paraded through Rome as a trophy. A faint breeze shifts, carrying you into another room, this one colder, lined with thick fur tapestries and the lingering scent of pine. Here, a Norse saga hums gently under the surface. You stand near the memory of Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king. A mainstream historical fact. He died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, an event that helped end the Viking Age. But there's a quirky detail. Some accounts say he charged into battle wearing nothing but a blue tunic, having left his armor behind during negotiations. Historians still argue how much of that is saga exaggeration, But you can imagine him shrugging like someone who confidently skipped the "Are you sure you want to continue?" You drift deeper into a quieter corner of royalty, where tapestries soften into silks and shimmering lanterns sway gently. Now the figure before you is Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the founder of China's Qin dynasty and the man who kick-started the Great Wall. A mainstream fact, he unified China in 221 BCE. But his death carries a softer, stranger edge. The quirky tidbit? He reportedly died from ingesting immortality pills made of mercury, which is one of those tragic ironies that feels like a cosmic joke delivered too late. Historians still argue whether his obsession with eternal life, ambition, or the desperate knowledge that power this vast rarely survives its first transfer. You watch him fade into the folds of his own mausoleum, surrounded by silent terracotta soldiers who never blink. Another corridor opens, swaying with warm candlelight, and you step into the world of medieval France. Here, King Charles VIII makes his appearance, not on a battlefield or a throne, but in a doorway. A mainstream fact, he strengthened France's influence in Italy during the Italian Wars. But how he left the world? He reportedly hit his head on a low doorway while walking to watch a tennis match. Yes, a tennis match. A quiet, oddly modern death for a king who once commanded armies. Historians still argue whether the blow alone killed him or whether a stroke followed. But you can almost hear him muttering in your ear, "No one mentioned this in the chronicles." Passing through another hall, you feel warmth, sunlight through delicate screens, the scent of figs and sweet wine, the hush of Roman luxury. You meet Emperor Claudius here, the man who expanded the Roman Empire into Britain. A mainstream fact, his reign was surprisingly effective despite early doubts. But his ending? Ancient writers claimed he was poisoned, possibly with mushrooms. Quirky detail, Romans called them the food of the gods, which adds a dramatically ironic twist. Historians still argue whether his wife Agrippina engineered the whole thing or whether Claudius simply had terrible culinary luck. You drift past him as he sits reclined, half smiling, unaware that a future emperor, Nero, is already being groomed behind the curtain. The scenery shifts again, this time to a palace where the floor glitters with tiles shaped like lotus petals. You're now moving through the world of the Mughal Empire. Emperor Humayun appears, a gentle, book-loving ruler known for his calm disposition. A mainstream fact, he expanded and stabilized the young empire during his reign. But the way he died feels almost like a fable. He fell down a flight of library steps after hearing the call to prayer and hurried to respond. Historians still argue whether the fall alone was fatal or whether underlying illness played a role. Still, you'd be hard-pressed to find another ruler whose final moment involved devotion, scholarship, and clumsy gravity all in one. You continue drifting, your steps nearly soundless on the soft carpets of a Persian palace. Here stands Cyrus the Younger, a prince whose ambitions were fierce, but whose final moments unfolded in confusion on a chaotic battlefield. A mainstream fact, he attempted to overthrow his brother Artaxerxes II. The quirky part? Some stories claim his head and right hand were cut off and displayed, while others say his body was honored. Historians still argue which version reflects reality. But here, in this softened dreamscape, you see only a prince who reached too far and whose end became a puzzle future ages had to piece together. Then you enter a chamber scented with sandalwood and rosewater. The Mughal emperors aren't done with you yet. This time you encounter Jahangir, a ruler known for art, poetry, and an almost Instagram-worthy love of nature. A mainstream fact, he stabilized relations with Persia and supported enormous artistic growth. But his passing was less glamorous. He reportedly died from complications related to alcohol and opium use. The quirky tidbit? He loved recording tiny observations, weather, flowers, animals, so meticulously that historians still argue whether parts of his memoirs are embellished for flair. You float past him, imagining him jotting notes even in his final days. Temperature, warm. Cause of death, TBD. As you continue wandering this palace of eras, the marble softens, the torchlight grows dimmer, and you sense an emerging truth. Even those crowned in gold were never immune to the softness, randomness, and occasionally ridiculous nature of mortality. Kings slipped, emperors miscalculated, queens faced rumors sharp enough to outlive their empires. But in this quiet, dreamlike space, their ends aren't violent or gruesome. They're simply human. You pause, listening to the gentle echo of silk banners. The royalty fade like lanterns dimming one by one, leaving only soft reflections behind. And you continue forward, ready to meet the next quiet cluster of unusual departures waiting in the shadows of history. You step away from the hushed chambers of kings and queens, letting the silks and marble dissolve into something rougher, bigger, and far more open. The air thins, cools, and suddenly tastes like dust, seawater, or sometimes both, because now you're walking alongside explorers. Not the dramatic, storm-battered versions from adventure films, but the real wanderers whose lives blended courage, curiosity, and, occasionally, endings that were more confusing than cinematic. Here, the landscape reshapes itself constantly. One moment you're on a creaking wooden deck, the next you're crunching across crunchy desert gravel, and then you're trudging above tree lines where the wind whistles like a tired kettle. This is the territory of people who pushed past known borders and then discovered that the world, while beautiful, can be wildly unpredictable, sometimes even creatively unhelpful. Your first companion here is Marco Polo. Not the pool game Marco Polo, but the real Venetian traveler who journeyed deep into Central Asia. A mainstream fact, he spent years in the service of Kublai Khan, documenting cultures, cities, and wonders Europeans had never imagined. But his death? Quiet, almost boring. After all the deserts, mountains, and political storms, he passed away peacefully at home. The quirky tidbit? On his deathbed, people begged him to admit he exaggerated his stories, and he simply whispered, "I have not told half of what I saw." Historians still argue whether this means he was unusually honest or unusually dramatic. As you drift past him, he gives you a wink that says, "Believe me or don't, your call." The world shifts beneath your feet, and suddenly you're on a ship rolling gently over turquoise water. Now you're close to Ferdinand Magellan, the first person whose expedition circumnavigated the globe. Emphasis on expedition, because Magellan himself didn't make it home. A mainstream fact, he was killed in the Philippines at the Battle of Mactan. But in this softened, sleep-friendly version, you don't see spears or conflict. You see him standing ankle-deep in warm water, arguing politely but stubbornly with the locals. One account claims he insisted on wading closer even when warned about the reefs and tides, like the historical equivalent of someone ignoring the wet floor sign with excessive confidence. Historians still argue how much of the story is factual and how much was shaped by Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler who really liked making Magellan look noble. You drift on, and now the salty air thickens into jungle humidity. Thick vines curl around your ankles, not enough to trip you, just enough to remind you that explorers often wandered into places that had no interest in being explored. Before you stands Percy Fawcett, the British explorer obsessed with finding a mythical city he called Z. A mainstream fact, he vanished in 1925 with his son and a companion while searching the Amazon basin. The quirky tidbit? He brought along a tin of powdered milk because he thought it would be the perfect food of the future. Historians still argue whether he was killed by an uncontacted tribe, died of starvation, or simply decided to disappear on purpose. In this soft dreamscape, you just see him stepping into tall grass, the jungle swallowing his silhouette with the gentlest shh. The scenery shifts once more, this time to a frozen whiteness so complete it feels like you're walking through a blank page. In the middle stands Captain Robert Falcon Scott, leader of the tragic Terra Nova expedition. A mainstream fact, he reached the South Pole only to discover Roald Amundsen had beaten him by weeks, and he later died on the return journey. The quirky detail? One of the men in his party, Lawrence Oates, famously walked out of their tent into a blizzard saying, "I am just going outside and may be sometime." A line that still shows up in British humor as the understatement of the century. Historians still argue about the errors, decisions, and weather patterns that doomed the mission. But here, Scott stands quietly beside you, the Antarctic wind no longer biting, only brushing gently like a cold pillow. You take a few steps and suddenly hear water slapping against wooden hulls. You blink, and now you're standing next to Henry Hudson, the man whose explorations gave his name to a bay and a river he probably never meant to become famous for. A mainstream fact, he explored parts of the Arctic and northeastern North America. But his end was grim in reality. His crew mutinied and set him adrift in a small boat. The quirky tidbit? Before that, he spent weeks trapped in ice during winter and wrote cheerful journal entries about how beautiful the northern lights were, a detail that feels like premium-level denial. Historians still argue whether the crew acted out of desperation or leadership grievances. In this softened version, though, you see Hudson gently drifting away on calm water, the northern lights hanging like pastel curtains overhead. You wander forward, brushing frost from your sleeves as the cold dissolves into desert heat. Sand stretches endlessly, the horizon shimmering. Here you meet Ibn Battuta, one of the greatest travelers in history, someone who journeyed over 70,000 miles before Google Maps could warn him about traffic. A mainstream fact, he documented his travels through Africa, the Middle East, India, and China. The quirky detail? He sometimes exaggerated his stories, describing places he never visited or events that seem improbable. Historians still argue which parts of his account are factual and which are the medieval equivalent of humble bragging. His death, though, is uncertain. He may have passed quietly in Morocco, the world finally allowing him to rest. The sand softens under your feet, turning into a grassy savanna where the air is warm and buzzing with insects. Here stands Mungo Park, the Scottish explorer who mapped parts of West Africa. A mainstream fact, his first expedition was difficult but successful enough to earn fame back home. His second? It ended mysteriously in the Niger River. The quirky tidbit? Park had a habit of refusing to change his European clothing even in extreme African heat, insisting on wearing wool as if cotton hadn't been invented. Historians still argue whether he drowned accidentally, was attacked, or succumbed to the environment. But you just see him drifting downstream in calm water, fading like a ripple. Another shift brings you to the high peaks of the Himalayas. Snow glitters, sun dazzles, and Sherpas move like ghosts ahead of you. You're now standing beside George Mallory, the mountaineer who famously disappeared on Everest in 1924. A mainstream fact, his body wasn't found until 1999. The quirky detail, he once joked that he climbed mountains because they're there, which remains the most iconic shrug in exploration history. Historians still argue whether he reached the summit before he died. In this softened world, you see him standing at a ridge, breathing calmly, the wind brushing past as though releasing him gently. All around you, explorers fade into the scenery. Some lost to oceans, some claimed by deserts, some swallowed by cold, others simply gone without explanation. Their endings weren't always heroic, but they were deeply human. Moments of reaching too far, trusting too much, or simply misjudging nature, because nature always votes last. You breathe in the quiet. The jungle hum fades. The snow melts to mist. The ship decks crease into clouds. And you continue drifting into the next unseen corner of history, ready for whatever strange, gentle departure awaits you there. You push onward into the soft dusk of the ancient world, the air warming slightly as you drift south and west, your steps becoming unhurried, like you've walked here many times before. The Nile is not yet in sight, but you can feel it. Somehow, every journey in antiquity eventually ends at Egypt, the way every late-night Wikipedia spiral ends in an article about cats. You breathe in, and the air tastes faintly sandy, faintly sweet, and faintly like you might now understand why every civilization kept sending people here. Maybe it's the climate, maybe it's the mystique, or maybe it's just the unbeatable lighting. Because honestly, between the golden sky and the drifting dust, this place always looks like it's been pre-filtered for social media. Tonight, you're heading toward one of the most theatrical exits in history, the death of Cleopatra VII. And yes, because you're very on brand, you walk toward this episode not with adrenaline, but with the slow, measured pace of someone browsing a bookstore at 2 a.m. You glance at the world around you, reed baskets drying in the fading sun, fishermen hauling in the day's last catch, and a few goats that stare at you like they know exactly how much sleep you haven't been getting lately. You arrive at Alexandria the way you approach most things in your life, mildly underdressed and probably too relaxed for the moment. Tall columns rise with carved papyrus capitals, and beyond them, the great library's ruins shimmer in memory. You wander the palace corridors, your sandals tapping softly on cool stone, and one of the guards gives you a look that definitely translates to tourists. It's fine, you're used to it. Inside, everything is dim and cool, and you follow the faint sound of water trickling from a fountain shaped like a lotus. Cleopatra's chambers are ahead, heavy with incense, frankincense maybe, or something rarer. The queen herself sits beyond the curtain, still poised even as her kingdom crumbles. You move slowly, as though not to disturb the scene, though honestly the drama has already happened without you. Cleopatra lies on a low couch, adorned in layers of linen and gold that look far too fancy for the situation. A faint smile curves her lips, as if she knows she's become the center of one of history's longest-running debates. Historians still argue whether she orchestrated everything exactly as the Roman sources claim, or whether those same Romans just couldn't resist adding flair. There are, famously, 3 possibilities for her death. 1, she used an asp, a snake delivered in some sort of basket. 2, she applied a poisonous ointment. 3, she used a sharp implement dipped in toxin. You bend down as though to inspect the details yourself, gently, respectfully, and honestly, you can see how the snake story became popular. Snakes have great marketing. But the poison ointment theory has its own charm, especially if you imagine Cleopatra applying it like an ancient night routine. Step 1, cleanse. Step 2, moisturize. Step 3, overthrow Roman imperialism with the power of cosmetics. You let out a tiny laugh at your own imagined infomercial, and the chamber acoustics catch it, softening it into something echoey and polite. A carved frieze overhead depicts the goddess Isis, arms outstretched, watching over the scene below. You tilt your head back to look at her, noticing how the flickering lamplight makes the carved wings seem to shift. There's a hush here, not secrecy exactly, but the kind of reverence people use when trying not to wake a sleeping cat. One mainstream fact drifts back to you. Cleopatra wasn't actually Egyptian by ancestry. She was Macedonian Greek, the last of the Ptolemies. But she embraced Egyptian culture fully, even learning the local language when most members of her dynasty didn't bother. You think about this as you walk slowly around the room, taking in the carved stools, the papyrus scrolls stacked neatly in bundles, the hollow bronze incense burners shaped like falcons. Each object seems to hum with a quiet resignation, as if aware that Rome is already tightening its grip on the world. A fringe tidbit floats up next, one of those odd historical rumors that has survived long past its expiration date. Some old writers claimed Cleopatra had a collection of tiny venomous creatures she kept specifically for testing poisons. You picture her strolling around with a purse full of scorpions like someone's quirky aunt who collects keychains. Is it true? Maybe, maybe not. People said a lot of things about Cleopatra. She was powerful, brilliant, multilingual, charismatic, and nothing makes people gossip like a competent woman in politics. Even in the ancient world, sexism was thriving like a desert weed. You round the couch where Cleopatra lies, her face serene and her hand curled gently at her side. The bite marks, if they existed, are not visible in the restful sweep of shadow. The air is warm, heavy, fragrant. You kneel, running your fingertips along the carved border of the couch, tracing lotus blossoms and stylized waves. Somewhere in the distance, the harbor water laps against stone docks, carrying voices that are slowly fading into evening. You hear the faintest shuffle, someone passing behind you, and you glance over your shoulder to see a servant setting down a bowl of milk near a doorway. She nods stiffly at you. You nod back because even in ancient palaces, you maintain your default emotional baseline of unintentionally polite squirrel. Walking back toward the balcony, you notice the city below stretching out under a deepening purple sky. Lanterns flicker, boats drift lazily, and a few gulls circle overhead, complaining loudly about their day. Wind brushes across your face, warm and soft, and for a moment you simply stand there, absorbing the hazy, almost dreamy calm of this place. If this is supposed to be one of history's most dramatic deaths, it's surprisingly peaceful, quiet, even elegant. A good reminder that sometimes the loudest stories end in whispers. You think again of scholars arguing, still endlessly, about what exactly happened here. Did Cleopatra plan every detail to deny Octavian his spectacle? Did her attendants help her? Was the snake even physically present? Or did Plutarch just really love a good visual metaphor? You shrug, because you've long accepted that you're not here to solve ancient mysteries. You're here to drift through them like a half-awake traveler, appreciating the edges without needing the complete picture. Kind of like checking your bank balance without actually clicking See Full Statement. As the night settles over Alexandria, you step back into the room for one final look. Cleopatra rests unchanged, still composed, still regal, even in death. That's the thing about some endings. They feel less like conclusions and more like transitions, like someone gently closing a book rather than slamming it shut. You exhale, slow and steady, then turn away, following the corridor deeper into the palace, letting the soft lantern glow guide you toward whatever history wants to whisper next. You follow the corridor until the palace stones gradually shift beneath your feet, becoming rougher, older, far less polished. The golden glow of Alexandria softens behind you, and the air cools as if someone quietly turned down the world's thermostat. Your steps slow, not from fear, just from that dreamy sense that you're drifting between centuries, like someone scrolling through history with a slightly sleepy thumb. The walls darken, torchlight flickers, and before you realize it, you've slipped into an entirely different world, the highlands of ancient Scotland. A low mist curls along the ground, cool against your ankles, and the faint scent of wet heather rises with each breath you take. This place feels hushed, not because anything horrible is about to happen, but because everything here seems to take itself very, very seriously. The hills brood, the crows brood, even the sheep probably brood. It's all extremely on brand for tonight's destination, the last stand and peculiar death of King James IV at the Battle of Flodden. You step forward onto soggy earth, your sandals now replaced, without your permission, by something sturdier and far more waterproof. Dew clings to your sleeves. Off in the distance loom the rolling ridges of Northumberland, where the battle once unfolded in 1513. And no, don't worry, you're not going to experience the battle itself in any loud, traumatic way. You're here for the quiet aftermath, the slow unraveling of a king's fate. As you approach the field, you hear nothing but the soft wind brushing over tall grass. It's hard to imagine armies here, tens of thousands of men, armored and grim. Instead, you see the ghostly outlines of tents, the kind that flicker at the edge of visibility, like they're shy about committing to existence. You move through them, brushing aside flaps of canvas that feel more like memory than fabric. James IV appears near the center, not dramatically, not mid-charge, but standing beside a low camp table with maps unfurled. His red beard catches a faint gleam of morning light. He's younger than you expect, more human, more thoughtful, less the tragic figure painted by later writers. There's a faint crease between his brows, the kind people get when pondering whether diplomacy might have been a better option after all. Historians still argue whether James truly intended a full-scale battle, or whether events simply spiraled too far, too fast, for him to rein things in. You step closer, your footsteps silent in the damp grass. The king doesn't see you. He's too lost in calculation, in worry, maybe even in stubborn pride. A mainstream fact slides quietly into your mind. James IV was the last reigning Scottish king to die in battle. It's one of those tidy historical milestones people like to tuck into documentaries to sound knowledgeable. But the quirky tidbit hits next. Something about James being extremely into astrology, commissioning horoscopes for major decisions. Maybe he should have checked the star chart for avoid large English armies this Thursday. You gently suppress a laugh, because somehow it feels rude to giggle near a monarch contemplating catastrophe. Your gaze drifts across the field where mist pools in low pockets. Sword blades poke from the earth like metal saplings. The lingering shapes of fallen soldiers surround you, not gruesome, not frightening, just silhouettes fading softly into dew. You pass through them like walking through fog, each one dissolving as you draw near. There's something tender about it, like the landscape itself has decided to cushion the harshness, smoothing the edges so the entire scene feels like a watercolor. James steps forward into the thickening haze. You follow, keeping your pace calm, steady, respectful. The world grows quieter, and you realize you're approaching the moment historians still debate: how exactly the king died. Traditional accounts say he fought bravely, sword in hand, refusing to yield until the very end. Others claim he might not have even reached the thick of battle before being struck by an English billhook. Some theories suggest misidentification of the body altogether, leading to centuries of confusion. You nod thoughtfully. History really does love a good mystery, especially when paperwork was optional. As you drift beside James, the terrain shifts underfoot, rising toward the crest where Scottish forces once stood. You look down toward the valley, gentle dips and rolling green now, but centuries ago, this ground turned slippery with mud and chaos. The soft wind carries a faint echo of distant drums. Not threatening, more like someone practicing the world's slowest marching rhythm. He pauses. He turns, as if sensing something beyond vision. His expression softens. He steps into a thicker column of mist, and when you follow, the world opens into a different space entirely. A quiet stone chapel, flickering with candlelight. Maybe symbolic? Maybe metaphoric? Maybe Scottish weather is just extra dramatic. Inside the chapel, James kneels in the dim glow, his armor creaking softly. The candles flutter like they're breathing with him. You walk slowly between the wooden pews, running one hand along their carved edges. Here, the king isn't a warrior, or a ruler, or a doomed historical figure. He's simply a man pausing before the end, thinking maybe, just maybe, that things could have gone another way. A single stained glass window filters the light into ripples of red and gold. You tilt your head, noticing how the colors play across James's face. He looks older in this light, not aged by years, but by consequence. You sit beside him on the low stone step, even if he can't see you, keeping him company in the last quiet moment before myth swallows him. He rises, walks toward the chapel door, and steps back onto the field, not into carnage, but into an open, cloud-touched meadow where everything seems gentler. And then, with a final breath, he simply fades into the mist, leaving behind nothing but a faint warmth where he stood. You linger a while longer, letting the breeze brush across your arms. The meadow stretches endlessly, soft hills rising and falling like a slow heartbeat. You inhale deeply, the scent of heather thick and comforting, and for a moment you stand perfectly still, not mourning, not analyzing, just letting this place settle around you like a wool blanket. When you finally move, the mist parts easily, and the landscape shifts toward your next destination. You take one last look over your shoulder at the quiet field, then continue forward, your steps slow and steady as the world gently rearranges itself around you. The meadow thins beneath your feet, the heather dissolving into warm dust, as if the ground itself has decided to change outfits right before your eyes. The air shifts, cool Scottish mist warming into something drier, heavier, almost metallic. You blink once, twice, and suddenly the landscape stretches into a wide open plain, baked by sun and layered with the faint scent of distant campfires. You don't rush. You never rush in these journeys. Instead, you continue at your usual bedtime wanderer pace, like someone browsing a museum just minutes before closing time. Shapes emerge on the horizon, low tents, banners catching a tired breeze, worn shields piled beside wooden stakes hammered into the ground. You've drifted to ancient Persia, far from the damp hills of Scotland, and into the last hours of King Cyrus the Great. His death is one of those stories historians tell with a nervous shrug, because honestly, nobody can agree on what happened. Some say he fell in battle, others say he died peacefully, and a few really committed storytellers insist he got into a fight with a Central Asian queen over a personal insult. Historians still argue whether that last one is dramatic flair or rooted in something resembling fact. You walk forward, dust puffing up around your ankles. Heat presses gently against your skin, not uncomfortable, just steady, like the warmth of a sleeping dog leaning against your leg. The Persian camp stretches before you, orderly rows of soldiers moving with the quiet discipline reserved for a man they genuinely respect. Cyrus was known not only as a conqueror, but as a ruler who valued fairness, who allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs. A mainstream fact, the Cyrus Cylinder is often called the world's first declaration of human rights. You think about that as you stroll between the tents, nodding politely at soldiers who don't quite see you but seem to shift slightly as you pass, as if acknowledging something in the corner of their awareness. Near the center is the king himself, Cyrus, broad-shouldered, bearded, wrapped in patterned robes that seem to shimmer in the desert light. He studies a map spread across a folding table, a few polished stones weighing down the corners. His generals stand nearby, their discussion low but tense. You drift in closer, pretending, as usual, that you're meant to be here. One general brushes a hand over a circular arc drawn in the sand, muttering something about supply lines and the terrain ahead. Cyrus listens with the patience of someone who has spent a lifetime making large, complicated decisions before breakfast. Your footsteps slow. The air grows thicker, not ominous, just charged with that subtle awareness that something significant is approaching. You don't see the battle, only the faint outline of it beginning to form beyond the ridge. Distant riders, dust plumes, the simmering sense of two forces circling each other like cats pretending not to care. But your purpose is not to witness the chaos. You're here for the quiet moment that comes later. Cyrus steps out of the tent, pausing long enough to tie a leather strap around his wrist. His face has that expression leaders get when they know the day will require more of them than most. You walk beside him, your stride unhurried, letting the sun warm your shoulders. The wind picks up, carrying hints of horses, sweat, roasted grains, and, oddly, something sweet like pomegranate. A fringe tidbit floats to mind. A few obscure sources claimed Cyrus loved pomegranates so much he planted orchards wherever he campaigned. Is it true? Maybe not, but the idea is charming enough to cling to, especially as you spot a soldier snacking on one nearby and absolutely failing to share. The world shifts again, subtly. One moment you're in the camp, the next you're crossing a wide open plain with nothing but the whisper of grass brushing against your sandals. The fighting is long over, reduced here to soft silhouettes scattered like ink-washed shadows, dispersed by wind. You pass through them calmly, your breath steady, your movements slow, so the shapes dissolve around you like harmless smoke. Cyrus lies at the crest of a small rise, the sun behind him casting his face into gentle shadow. There is no violence here, no horror, just the quiet, inevitable end of a long life lived at full stride. He looks peaceful, oddly enough, as if resting after a long journey rather than collapsing at the close of one. You kneel beside him, fingertips brushing the dry earth. His armor is dented in a few places, but nothing about him seems defeated. The expression on his face is serene, almost thoughtful, like he's still considering whether this outcome was strategically sound. You realize how strange it is that one of the world's most legendary conquerors might have met such an ambiguous end. Some sources say he died fighting the Massagetai. Others say he passed peacefully in his capital. You sit back on your heels, letting that uncertainty wash over you. Humans love neat endings, but history rarely cooperates. You glance at the horizon, where the light softens into a gentle amber glow. A lone hawk circles overhead, its call drifting faintly through the warm air. You tilt your gaze upward and consider, briefly, the oddity that so many ancient rulers believed birds held prophetic meaning. Cyrus would have respected the symbolism. You, on the other hand, mostly just admire the bird's ability to look majestic while doing basically nothing. You stand, brushing dust from your palms, and the landscape shifts again, gently, gratefully, softer hills forming under your feet. A small stone platform emerges beside you, the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargada, carved in simple, elegant lines. You ascend the steps slowly, pausing halfway to admire the minimalism. Honestly, if ancient rulers had Pinterest, this tomb would be on every mood board. Clean angles, pale stone, zero clutter. It's very king of the world, but also trending in home decor. Inside, it's cool and dark, the temperature dropping in a comforting way, like walking into a grocery store freezer section in summer. You find yourself whispering without meaning to, though no one is here to hear you. Something about the space encourages quiet, reverence, a feeling that endings don't need to be loud to matter. You walk to the back, running your fingertips along the smooth stone. There's a carved inscription, at least according to later writers, that supposedly read, "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who won the empire for the Persians. Do not begrudge me this handful of earth that covers my body." You mouth the words silently, though no one can confirm if they were ever there. Another debate, another lingering guess. You step back outside into the warm light, letting the sun settle on your shoulders again. The world is shifting once more, the edges blurring, the horizon bending toward your next destination. You take one last slow breath, savoring the dusty sweetness of Persia, the quiet dignity of Cyrus's final resting place, and the gentle hush that follows even the grandest of lives. Then you walk forward, unhurried, knowing the next story is already forming in the warm air ahead. The sunlit plains of Persia fade beneath your feet like a mural being gently wiped clean, the warm breeze dissolving into something thicker, wetter, and buzzing faintly with life. You blink as the air around you shifts into a lush humidity, and when your eyes adjust, you're no longer standing in the middle of a desert empire. You're surrounded by towering bamboo, hanging vines, and the layered sounds of 1,000 unseen creatures politely arguing about territory. The rainforest canopy above filters the sunlight into long, soft beams, and you move through it at your usual sleepy sightseer pace. Your footsteps rustle the leaves, but even the forest seems to be half dozing, offering no danger, just the kind of deep, gentle warmth that makes you wonder if you're slowly becoming a houseplant. A narrow path appears beneath your feet, trodden by countless soldiers long ago, though now it's overgrown enough that vines loop across your ankles like clingy toddlers. You nudge them aside, continuing forward until the trees part, revealing a muddy clearing and the beginning of one of Southeast Asia's most legendary, wait, what actually happened, exits. The disappearance and probable death of Ngo Quen, the 10th century Vietnamese ruler who once sank an entire Chinese fleet using wooden stakes hidden underwater. Mainstream fact. That Battle of Bac Dong is still considered a strategic masterpiece. But tonight isn't about his victory. It's about the last, quiet uncertainty of his life. Because historians still argue whether Ngo Quen died naturally in his palace or fell during a smaller, less documented military conflict. You step into the clearing, half expecting some epic showdown, but instead you find a calmness settling over the scene, the kind that would make even the forest spirits pause mid-argument. Ngo Quen stands at the center of it, dressed not in royal regalia, but in simple armor, lacquered plates polished to a soft sheen. His posture is steady, but there's an unmistakable heaviness to him, like a man taking stock of his life while trying to ignore the administrative headache of ruling a newly independent nation. You approach quietly, the damp earth sinking slightly under each step. Nearby, soldiers kneel around a fire, cooking something that smells suspiciously like grilled fish, but also a little like regret. A fringe tidbit pops into your mind. Some old stories claim Ngo Quen favored meals flavored with wild pepper vines he handpicked himself, because even victorious generals sometimes moonlight as enthusiastic foragers. True? Unknown? Absolutely. You step closer to Ngo Quen, watching the way his eyes scan the forest, not fearfully, More like he's listening, trying to interpret the rustle of leaves, as if the trees themselves might offer political advice. You stand beside him for a moment, inhaling the earthy scent of rain-soaked bark and distant river water. Then, the world shifts. It's subtle at first, the sound of the forest flattening, the humid breeze pausing mid-stroke, and then the clearing melts into the wide courtyard of a wooden palace. Quiet, lantern-lit, smelling faintly of incense and warmed teak. You look around and find yourself in Koloa Citadel, the seat of Ngokwen's short-lived but crucial reign. The palace is peaceful, almost too peaceful. A few servants pass by carrying scrolls or bowls of steaming herbal tea. One offers you a cup, and you accept it out of reflex, though your hand passes through it like mist. Awkward. The servant blinks, confused, shrugs, and keeps walking. You take a pretend sip anyway, because psychologically, you deserve tea. Ngokwen enters the courtyard from the opposite side, this time wearing silk robes embroidered with swirling waves. His expression is reflective, the look of a man rewinding his own story. You follow him, your footsteps echoing lightly against polished stone. He stops beside a lotus pond, gazing at the drifting petals. You crouch beside him, watching golden fish glide beneath the surface, unconcerned with the weight of kingdoms or the fragile tensions between new dynasties. The quiet is almost hypnotic. And then, without warning, everything vibrates softly, like a long-held breath finally exhaling. You look up and see the lantern lights flicker. Ngokwen's hand touches his chest. He sways, not dramatically, not like the movies, but like someone who's simply gone too long without rest. He sinks down onto a carved wooden bench, face calm, eyes turned toward the pond. You sit with him, letting the stillness settle deeply around you. The night air thickens with the scent of lotus and warm rain. If this is his real ending, it is gentle, human, undisturbed by spectacle. It feels right for a leader who, despite battle prowess, rebuilt his country not with terror, but with structure, diplomacy, and a surprisingly practical tax system. You breathe slowly, absorbing the moment. But then a whisper of wind curls through the courtyard, and suddenly the scene cracks slightly, as if history itself is reminding you that this is only one version. The courtyard dissolves again into the rainforest clearing. Ngokwen stands where you left him, armor glinting faintly. A shout echoes through the trees, soldiers tense. The ruler steps forward, calm, resolute. Another possibility, another ending. He raises a hand, orders his men back, and disappears into the trees alone. You follow, of course, because you're nosy in a gentle way. The forest grows darker, moisture beads on your skin. Somewhere, a bamboo grove creaks like it's gossiping. Ngokwen pushes deeper into the undergrowth, moving with the confidence of someone who knows this land as well as he knows his own thoughts. You walk behind him, the air tightening, the shadows deepening. And then the forest opens into a cliffside, overlooking a slow, winding river. Ngokwen stops at the edge, gazing across the water. Sunlight breaks through the canopy, illuminating him in a soft halo. The wind lifts his hair. For a long moment, you stand there together, both of you quiet, both of you aware of the strange, unresolved nature of some lives. Then, like a candle being gently pinched out, he vanishes. No battle cry, no collapse, just a soft erasure into the warm, humming air. You look at the river, letting the final image settle. The rainforest exhales. A bird calls overhead. Somewhere, a drop of water plinks from a leaf to the earth. And you turn away, letting the path reform beneath your feet, carrying you out of the humid embrace of the forest and into the next chapter that waits, quietly, just beyond the trees. As the last hues of daylight dissolved behind the Roman horizon and the soft glow of oil lamps flickered against plastered walls, another kind of work began, quiet, meticulous, endlessly patient. It was the work of the scribes, scholars, notaries, mathematicians, librarians, and philosophers, whose steady hands and disciplined minds kept the Roman world functioning, learning, counting, and remembering. While soldiers marched, farmers planted, merchants bargained, and nobles schemed. These unseen thinkers formed a quiet backbone of the empire, the intellectual machinery that recorded contracts, preserved laws, calculated taxes, tracked grain shipments, copied literary works, measured distances, and ensured that even in a sprawling and complex society, order did not dissolve into chaos. Tonight, we walk gently into their realm, the world of Roman thought, writing, and knowledge-keeping, an empire sustained not only by power, but by ink, wax, and quiet minds. Tabula, wax, and papyrus. If you stepped into a Roman administrative office, known as a tabularium, you would be welcomed not by loud conversation, but by the rhythmic scratch of styluses carving words into wax tablets. These tablets, framed in wood and filled with a smooth layer of dark wax, were the everyday notebooks of the Roman world. They could be heated, smoothed, reused endlessly, and filled again with fresh notes, numbers, lists, names, shipments, taxes. Scribes sat at narrow desks, one leg tucked underneath them, stylus in hand, tablet on knee. They worked steadily, often surrounded by shelves full of previous tablets bound together like thick, heavy ledgers. When a note or contract needed to be made permanent, it was copied to papyrus scrolls, the official medium for long-term storage. Papyrus was more delicate, more expensive, and treated with far greater respect. A single roll could contain the equivalent of dozens of pages. A scribe would unroll the papyrus gradually across a wooden board, dipping a nibbed reed pen into a small clay pot of ink. The ink, made from soot, gum, and water, glistened as it dried. And so the empire was recorded line by line, roll by roll, pen stroke by pen stroke. The offices that kept Rome moving. To understand how central these tasks were, imagine the institutions that depended on scribes and scholars. 1. The census office. Every 5 years, Roman citizens were counted, taxed, and registered. Without scribes, none of this would have been possible. They sorted families by region, tracked changes in property, and updated rolls that would determine military service, voting rights, and taxation. 2. The grain distribution records. Rome and her enormous population relied on grain shipments arriving from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Scholars and clerks monitored these shipments carefully. A single miscalculation could starve thousands. 3. The legal archives. Rome's strength lay in its laws, complex, evolving, deeply influential. Notaries copied decrees, preserved court decisions, and ensured judges had references to past rulings. Without them, Roman law might have dissolved into confusion. 4. Military engineering plans. The great roads, aqueducts, siege engines, and fortifications required mathematicians and draftsmen who could sketch carefully measured drawings, calculate angles, and verify construction dimensions. 5. Public libraries and scriptoria. Rome's libraries, though not as famous as Alexandria's, housed thousands of scrolls. Scholars copied, preserved, and organized them. Knowledge flowed through their hands. Even the water supply, carefully measured by inspectors, depended on written records of flow rates and maintenance schedules. The empire functioned because someone was always writing something down. A day in the life of a Roman scribe. Let us follow one such scribe, Marcus Aemilius, a young, quiet, steady man, through his day. Marcus wakes as the sun edges above the rooftops. His home is small, a single room with a modest bed, a chest, a folding table, a few shelves with wax tablets, and a single bronze oil lamp. His clothing is simple, his meals humble, but he holds a job of immense importance. He makes his way through the crowded Roman streets, past vendors opening their stalls, past bakers drawing bread from clay ovens, past the distant roar of morning traffic at the Forum. His office, the tabularium for the local magistrate, stands at the edge of a square. Inside, the world is calmer. Lamps burn softly. Senior scribes give nods of greeting. The air smells faintly of warm wax, ink, papyrus, and olive oil. Marcus's tasks change each day. Sometimes he copies contracts for land purchases. Other days, he records grain weights as shipments arrive at the docks. Sometimes he transcribes legal speeches. Sometimes he checks lists for errors. Sometimes he writes receipts. Hours pass in peaceful concentration. The scratching of styluses becomes a kind of rhythm. Outside, Rome bustles, but here, thought and order prevail. At noon, Marcus shares a simple lunch, a bit of bread, olives, and cheese with fellow scribes. Conversation is quiet. News of a new shipment from Alexandria, a philosophical debate about Stoicism, a discussion on a newly discovered poem. By the end of the day, his fingers are stained with ink, his tunic dusted with tiny flakes of wax. He walks home slowly, enjoying the cool air, knowing that tomorrow he will pick up his stylus again. The empire depends on him, even if it rarely notices. Philosophers and the gentle pursuit of knowledge. While scribes kept the empire functioning day to day, philosophers immerse themselves in deeper questions. What is virtue? What is reason? What is the good life? Rome inherited much of its philosophical tradition from Greece, but Romans adapted these teachings to their own needs. Stoics like Seneca and Epictetus emphasized tranquility, duty, and self-control. Their writings were not dramatic, but calming, directions for living wisely in a turbulent world. Epicureans sought peace through simple pleasures and freedom from unnecessary desires. They believed that calmness, not wealth, produced happiness. Academics and peripatetics debated logic, ethics, and natural science. They recorded astronomical observations, studied plants, and wrote treatises on geometry. Their classrooms were courtyards, shaded colonnades, private gardens behind wealthy homes. Students gathered around them not just to learn theory, but to train their minds for clearer thought and steadier living. These philosophers, too, were essential to Rome. They gave meaning to life in the empire, taught future leaders to think carefully, and ensured that Roman culture was more than roads and armies. It was also ideas. The quiet genius of Roman engineering minds. No empire of Rome's scale could have existed without the intellectual work of engineers. They designed aqueducts that delivered millions of water, roads stretching thousands of miles, bridges spanning valleys, and heating systems that warmed villas in winter. Their notebooks, often lost to time, would have contained complex measurements, miniature sketches, and calculations. They likely reviewed old Greek works, debated angles of arches, and corrected drafts with charcoal or ink. A Roman aqueduct was not merely a marvel of stone and mortar. It was, first, an idea, carefully measured, precisely planned. Libraries, the empire's memory. Roman libraries were serene sanctuaries of knowledge. Shelves stretching from floor to ceiling held scrolls, histories, plays, medical texts, poems, treatises, maps. Visitors walked softly. Scribes copied works in side chambers. Wealthy patrons funded new collections. Scholars read in the cool shade, listening to the faint rustle of scrolls. Some libraries were public, open to any citizen. Others were private collections, belonging to noble families. Regardless of ownership, they served a sacred role. They kept knowledge alive. The empire's silent strength. We often imagine Rome's power coming from its legions and laws, its emperors and monuments. But just as important were the quiet minds working behind the scenes. The scribe bent over his tablet, the scholar copying a fragile scroll, the engineer sketching a future aqueduct, the librarian organizing shelves, the philosopher teaching calmness in an unpredictable world. They rarely made history, yet they preserved it. They rarely commanded armies, yet they kept the empire functioning. And though their names are mostly forgotten, their work remains alive in every surviving document, in every building still standing, in every thread of knowledge handed down through centuries. Rome endured not only because it was strong, but because it remembered. The quiet rhythm of Rome fades behind you, replaced by the humid, salt-tinged air of a northern coast where the fog rolls in gently over low hills and shallow waters. You step onto the misty banks of the English Channel, a place where history seems to breathe slowly, deliberately, as if aware that it carries stories the wind itself prefers to whisper rather than shout. This is the territory of maritime explorers and naval commanders, whose ends were as varied as the tides themselves. Tonight, you follow one of them, not in the crashing chaos of battle, but in the soft, inevitable drift toward the quiet moments that define human endings. You walk along the shoreline, sand cool beneath your feet, dotted with driftwood and seaweed curling in slow arcs. Off in the distance, the outline of a ship emerges, sails slack in the early morning breeze. This is Sir Francis Drake, not quite the dramatic figure textbooks sometimes promise, but a man who spent his life skimming the edges of empires, raiding, circumnavigating, and sometimes simply staring out at the horizon as if it held the answers to unasked questions. Drake completed the second circumnavigation of the globe, returning to England in 1580 to cheers and knighthood. But the end of his story is quieter than one might expect. He did not die heroically at sea or in a blaze of glory. Instead, he passed in 1596 in his own bed, weakened by dysentery and reportedly muttering faintly about maps and ships he'd never see again. There's a subtle, tender quality to that, an ending steeped in reflection rather than spectacle. You wander along the deck in your mind, imagining the faint creak of wood and the smell of brine mingled with tar. A fringe tidbit drifts into thought. Drake reportedly carried a small collection of exotic animals on some voyages, including a tame Barbary ape. It sat quietly in the rigging, observing sailors as though taking notes. Historians still argue whether this creature truly accompanied him, or if it's an embellishment by the admiring chroniclers who wanted to make his voyages sound whimsical. You can't help smiling at the mental image of a tiny monkey calmly ignoring the chaos of naval life while Drake navigated storms, pirates, and political intrigue. Beyond Drake, the mist softens and folds into the next story. You find yourself on the icy waters of the North Sea, where the wind carries a sharper chill and the smell of cold, wet stone from the cliffs. Here, you encounter Sir John Franklin, the Arctic explorer obsessed with finding the Northwest Passage. A mainstream fact, Franklin's 1845 expedition vanished without a trace, sparking decades of search missions and speculation. His crew faced freezing temperatures, starvation, and icebound ships that groaned in the endless night. The scene is subdued, almost dreamlike. You do not witness suffering in sharp detail. You simply walk beside Franklin as he pauses on a frozen deck, staring out at a landscape of ice and gray sky, the wind brushing softly against his cheeks. The quirky tidbit: Franklin reportedly kept a stash of canned food that none of his men could open correctly, metal tins that were poorly sealed and nearly impossible to access with the tools of the time. Historians still argue whether mismanaged supplies, harsh weather, or the inevitable darkness of the Arctic night contributed most to his disappearance. In this gentle, bedtime version, and the quiet endurance of human hope, the world shifts again as you drift down rivers that twist through dense jungles, the air thick with humid perfume and the faint buzz of insects. Here you glimpse Henry Hudson navigating the waterways of what would later be called New York and Hudson Bay. A mainstream fact: Hudson was set adrift by mutinous crew members in 1611 and never seen again. But imagine it differently, softly, slowly. A man in a small boat, drifting over mirrored water, lantern in hand, waves lapping gently against the hull, the northern lights winking overhead like playful guardians. Hudson reportedly refused to eat local fish at times, preferring stale ship provisions he deemed safer, a stubbornness that arguably contributed to the tension with his crew. Historians still argue whether the mutiny was inevitable or avoidable, a classic case of personality clashes combined with environmental cruelty. You walk beside him, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of wind and water, observing a quiet end that is more about drift and stillness than confrontation. The air softens as you transition into warmer latitudes. You are now on the coral-lined coasts of the Pacific, where tropical rain falls in gentle, steady sheets. Here, Abel Tasman moves through your awareness. A mainstream fact: he explored Tasmania and New Zealand in the 1640s, mapping islands and claiming territories for the Dutch East India Company. His death, however, was quiet decades later in Batavia, far from the blue oceans he charted. Tasman reportedly named islands whimsically, sometimes after people he had little reason to commemorate or after trivial annoyances like Van Diemen's Land, which later became Tasmania. Historians still argue whether these names reflected personal vanity, political necessity, or just the whimsical mindset of a man navigating vast, unknown oceans. You drift alongside him, imagining him staring at unfamiliar shores, notebook in hand, feeling a profound mixture of accomplishment and wistful curiosity. Your journey carries you farther south, where the sun warms the skin and the air carries the scent of eucalyptus. Here, the story of James Cook appears in soft focus. A mainstream fact: Cook charted New Zealand and Australia extensively, expanding European knowledge of the Pacific. He met his end in Hawaii during a skirmish with islanders in 1779. But you approach the scene gently. The boats bob in gentle waves, the tropical sky blushing with sunset. And Cook's final moments, though tragic, are softened by distance and perspective. The fringe detail emerges. Cook had a habit of measuring the health of his crew meticulously, even using fresh citrus to stave off scurvy, an almost obsessive attention to detail that likely saved many lives. Historians still argue whether his interactions with local populations could have been handled more diplomatically, or if conflict was inevitable due to cultural misunderstandings. You drift silently, witnessing a man defined as much by curiosity and care as by his eventual, sudden disappearance. The sea recedes, gently transitioning into tranquil rivers and slow-moving estuaries, carrying you toward explorers whose ends were quietly heroic, frustratingly ambiguous, or unexpectedly serene. Each figure you encounter has their own rhythm: drift, observation, calculation, quiet decision. You notice the faint, almost imperceptible similarities, the weight of responsibility, the strange loneliness of command, the fleeting, gentle triumphs amid uncertainty. Even as the fog lifts slightly, revealing glimpses of distant shores, you carry forward the sense that exploration is often less about the dramatic spectacle of death and more about the soft unfolding of human perseverance. Here, the end is rarely violent or immediate. It is thoughtful, reflective, and in many ways intimate. These explorers do not die on stage. They drift, pause, vanish quietly, leaving ripples for history to remember and scholars to debate for centuries. And so, you step back from the edge of the world and let the gentle tides carry you forward. The mist curls around your ankles like silk, the water murmurs its soft approval, and the light dims in a slow, patient manner. You are aware of the immense scope of human curiosity, the countless journeys undertaken, the quiet conclusions reached, the unknowns left to historians. The end of one voyage always gives way to another, and in this slow unfolding, you feel the delicate, hypnotic pulse of history itself, a rhythm perfectly suited for soft reflection and drifting toward rest. The wind ruffles your hair. You glance at the calm waters, imagining every explorer who has ever stared into the distance and wondered if tomorrow would find them. Some answers were found, some never were, and some endings were quietly beautiful, uncelebrated, and entirely sufficient. With that, you continue forward, your steps soft on the sand, your mind tracing the gentle arcs of ships, stars, and stories, floating toward the next chapter that waits, as always, just beyond the mist. The soft, salt breeze of distant oceans fades, replaced by the cooler, forested slopes of Central Europe. The mist curls low, threading through pines and oaks, and the distant murmur of a river accompanies your steps like a lullaby. You move slowly, deliberately, as though aware that in these woods, history has a way of lingering longer than the living. Tonight, you enter the quiet, tense, and often overlooked realm of medieval courts, the places where kings, queens, and nobles met ends far more subtle than battle cries, yet no less consequential. You approach a castle perched on a hill, stone walls softened by moss, towers rising like gentle reminders of centuries past. The gates stand open, though there is no one to guard them. The inhabitants of this world are mostly ghosts, wandering corridors with soft footfalls and murmured conversations. You follow the echo of quiet voices into a hall lined with tapestries depicting hunts, feasts, and mythic beasts. The smell of burned wood and candle wax mingles with faint traces of herbs used to perfume rooms, calming nerves, masking decay, or sometimes warding off spirits. Or at least, that's what people claimed. Tonight's focus is Richard III of England, the king who has fascinated historians for centuries. A mainstream fact, he ruled from 1483 to 1485 and was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the last king of the House of York. But here, you approach it not as a battlefield dramatization, but as a meditation on the quiet unraveling of ambition, the impermanence of power, and the soft inevitability of human endings. Richard stands in the dim light of a chamber, not armored for war, but in simple robes, a crown set gently aside on a carved table. He runs a hand across a polished surface, tracing the lines of the wood like he's reading them. A fringe tidbit floats to mind. He reportedly had a personal penchant for cataloging his possessions meticulously, from tapestries to silverware. Historians still argue whether this reflects careful planning, obsessive tendencies, or merely the habits of a man trying to maintain control in a world slipping through his fingers. The hall around him is quiet. Courtiers have long since disappeared. leaving only the faint scent of incense and the subtle chill of stone. You drift beside him, stepping lightly across the floorboards, listening to the echo of his measured breaths. This is not a death of gore or sudden collapse. It is the slow dissolution of influence, the acknowledgement that the tide of history cannot be held back by will alone. Richard moves to a window overlooking rolling fields dotted with distant figures, the armies preparing for the fateful engagement. From here, you can see the faint outline of Bosworth Field, soft in the morning haze, soldiers just beginning their march, horses pawing at dew-dampened grass. The air carries the scent of wet earth and animals, muted by distance, almost like the world itself is holding its breath. You pause to imagine the psychological landscape of a king moments before his last battle. Not fear exactly, but awareness, a quiet understanding that even the most carefully constructed plans may not survive contact with chaos. He surveys the horizon with calm acceptance, the weight of lineage, duty, and expectation settling like a soft cloak across his shoulders. There is a mainstream recognition that Richard was a formidable strategist, deeply learned in the art of both diplomacy and war. Yet, here in the dim chamber, you witness the human side, the private contemplation of mortality, the gentle acknowledgement of limits. A fringe detail surfaces. Some chroniclers mention Richard's fondness for hunting hawks, a hobby he reportedly pursued with meticulous attention to timing and technique. Historians still argue whether these pursuits were purely leisure, symbolic demonstrations of power, or early experiments in observation and patience that informed his military strategies. You can picture him adjusting the bird's jesses, whispering softly to the creature, both of them poised in shared concentration, a delicate, humanizing moment amid the larger forces at play. You move closer as Richard quietly consults a map, tracing the flow of rivers and ridges, noting where marshes might slow enemy movements and where hills could offer advantage. His fingers hover over the terrain with an almost reverent patience, as if he can feel the soft pulse of the earth beneath his touch. There is no urgency here, only a calm, deliberate engagement with the inevitable. Outside, the morning sun rises slowly, brushing the fields with gold. You can almost hear the rustle of armor, the soft clatter of soldiers' boots, and yet the scene remains distant, dreamlike, muted in its impact. This is the paradox of Richard III's end. It is framed by dramatic events, yet the moments leading to it were composed of quiet reflection, measured planning, and a serene acceptance of fate. You follow him down a narrow stair, stone smooth beneath your feet, into the small, austere chapel where he pauses to kneel. Candlelight flickers, illuminating the carved faces of saints in gentle relief. The air smells faintly of herbs, smoke, and lingering incense. He bows his head, fingers interlaced, eyes closed. You sense the stillness, a meditation not just on battle, but on life, legacy, and the ephemeral nature of power. Richard's death at Bosworth marked the end of the Wars of the Roses and the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Yet here, in this hushed space, the political earthquake is almost irrelevant. What matters is the intimate human dimension, the end of a life, the soft echo of ambition, the fleeting presence of someone who once held an entire kingdom in his hands. A fringe tidbit drifts next. A small engraving found centuries later suggests that Richard favored a specific type of prayer before battle, a ritual involving the lighting of candles and a silent contemplation of past rulers. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or a later embellishment, but in your quiet wandering, it feels deeply plausible. You imagine him kneeling, candlelight flickering, the faint scent of wax and herbs curling around him, grounding him in his final hours. You rise with him, following the echo of his footsteps across stone floors that have felt countless pairs of feet before yours. You leave the chapel and step back into the cool morning air. The fields stretch endlessly, soft green under a pale sky. The distant army dissolving into gentle shapes that do not threaten, only suggest movement and consequence. Richard turns toward the horizon, pauses, and then walks into the morning haze, a figure defined by both historical record and the softer human truths that survive the centuries. In this quiet, you understand something essential. Not every death is a dramatic crescendo. Some are composed of calm acceptance, careful reflection, and a deep, almost reverent engagement with the world that will continue without them. Richard III's end, like so many others you have visited tonight, is a subtle reminder that power is fleeting, life is transient, and the softest moments often contain the deepest truths. You pause at the edge of the hill, feeling the wind on your face, the smell of dew and grass rising around you. The mist curls in gently spirals, carrying with it the echoes of lives quietly concluded, ambitions softly surrendered, and legacies that will be pondered, debated, and quietly remembered for centuries. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air fill your lungs, and step forward, guided by the gentle pulse of history, toward the next story waiting quietly just beyond the hills. The hills of England fade beneath your feet, softened by the gentle mist of early morning, and the landscape folds into wide, sun-dappled valleys where vineyards stretch lazily along gentle slopes. The air is warm now, carrying the faint scent of grapes, hay, and distant wood smoke, a soft perfume that invites slow wandering. You tread carefully, letting the rhythms of the land ease you forward, and soon find yourself walking among the stone and timber houses of Renaissance Italy, where the lives and deaths of artists and thinkers are woven into the very streets you traverse. Tonight, you are drawn to the quiet, contemplative end of Leonardo da Vinci, the polymath whose mind seemed to hold the universe in balance. A mainstream fact: Leonardo passed away in 1519 at the age of 67 in the small town of Amboise, France, where he had been invited by King Francis I. He died peacefully, reportedly in the king's arms, leaving behind notebooks filled with sketches, observations, and ideas that spanned anatomy, flight, painting, engineering, and more. But here, you approach the scene not as a historical record, but as a gentle meditation on a life lived in curiosity, contemplation, and subtle triumph. You walk through the sunlit corridors of his final residence, the Château du Clos Lucé, where drafts from open windows rustle the papers on low tables. The room smells faintly of ink, old wood, and the faint metallic tang of pigments used for painting. Leonardo moves slowly, his hands hovering over sketches of flying machines and anatomical drawings, fingers tracing the delicate lines as if reading them for the first time. A fringe tidbit: he reportedly carried small mechanical devices he had invented himself, folding them into pockets and presenting them to the curious visitors who occasionally passed by. Historians still argue whether these devices were practical inventions or whimsical experiments born of endless curiosity. You follow him to a large window that overlooks the gentle Loire River. Light dances across the water, illuminating the edges of his notebooks and highlighting the faint dust motes that float lazily in the air. Leonardo leans slightly, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if measuring the light and shadow for a painting only he can see. You sense a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from decades of inquiry and exploration, from knowing that one has asked questions no one else has considered, and, in small ways, sketched the answers into permanence. The air around you softens, carrying the distant chirping of birds and the low hum of the river. Leonardo moves to a small table where a half-finished sketch of the human hand rests beneath his palm. You kneel beside him, letting your fingertips hover over the delicate lines without touching them. There is reverence in the stillness, a recognition that this is a life measured not by conquests or wealth, but by observation, creativity, and the patient pursuit of understanding. A mainstream fact resurfaces in your mind. Leonardo's notebooks would not be published or widely read for centuries, yet their influence shaped art, science, and engineering long after his passing. His work embodies the quiet endurance of human thought, the slow ripple of ideas that persist beyond the lifespan of their creator. You reflect on that quietly as he settles into a high-backed chair, folding his hands over his chest, eyes half closed, listening to the gentle flow of the Loire outside. A fringe detail flits across your imagination. Some accounts suggest Leonardo was left-handed to an unusual degree, writing in mirror script so that only he could easily read his notes. Historians still argue whether this was purely a habit or a deliberate attempt to obscure his ideas from curious onlookers. You find the image charming, Leonardo smiling faintly as he scribbles backward across a page, fully aware that only his mind can follow, content with secrets preserved in ink. You watch him settle into the chair near the window, the soft light caressing his face, highlighting the fine lines etched over decades of observation and creation. There is no dramatic scene here, no sudden collapse. Instead, there is the quiet alignment of a life well lived, the gentle fading of energy into the slow unfolding of evening, the soft, inevitable decline that comes when curiosity has been satisfied only temporarily, and yet remains forever insatiable in spirit. The room hums with tranquility. Outside, the Loire glistens under the afternoon sun, and the breeze stirs the leaves of the garden, carrying faint scents of herbs and flowers. Leonardo closes his eyes, not in sleep, but in reflection. His mind drifts across the landscapes he has studied, the faces he has painted, the inventions he has imagined, the questions he has left for future generations. You kneel beside him, observing without intruding, aware that this is one of those rare moments in history where the end of a life carries neither spectacle nor finality, but quiet resonance. You rise slowly, letting your gaze travel over the room, the sketches, the gentle light, the river beyond. Every object seems imbued with purpose, as if the air itself remembers the meticulous care with which Leonardo treated the world. You feel a sense of calm, the kind that comes from witnessing an ending shaped not by circumstance, but by intention, reflection, and patience. A faint breeze rustles the pages of a notebook left open on the table. You lean closer, noticing diagrams of flying machines, anatomical sketches, and abstract explorations of light and shadow. The details are delicate, precise, and curious, an echo of a mind that never stopped asking, never stopped wondering. Historians still argue over which inventions were practical and which remained purely imaginative, yet the enduring beauty lies in the meticulous pursuit itself. Finally, you step back toward the doorway, allowing the gentle warmth of the sun and the soft hum of the river to accompany you. Leonardo remains seated, half-shadowed, half-illuminated, a figure suspended in a perfect balance of inquiry and repose. You take a deep breath, absorbing the tranquil energy of the room, and step forward, carried by the soft pull of history into the next story, the next quiet chapter waiting just beyond the Loire's gentle bend. Here, in the fading light, you understand a subtle truth. Not every end is a crescendo. Not every life concludes with drama. Some fade like a warm, lingering breath, leaving behind thoughts, sketches, and ideas that ripple softly through time. And in those moments, even death is an art form, composed of patience, reflection, and the quiet accumulation of human curiosity. You continue onward, your footsteps light, your mind filled with the gentle resonance of a man who lived fully in observation, creation, and thought, and whose soft departure echoes still in the calm corridors of memory and imagination. The warm, sunlit landscapes of Renaissance Italy slowly blur and dissolve, replaced by the soft, cool mists of the Scottish Highlands. You walk along narrow, winding paths that follow the curves of low hills, the damp earth giving slightly beneath your feet. The air is thick with the scent of heather, peat, and faint smoke curling lazily from distant cottages. There's a calm rhythm here, the kind that makes your steps slow naturally, as if the landscape itself is guiding you toward reflection rather than haste. Tonight, you drift into the quieter corners of rebellion, intrigue, and the soft, lingering shadows of lives ended far from the spotlight, beginning with Mary, Queen of Scots. You enter a stone corridor lined with tall, narrow windows. Light filters in, casting thin ribbons across the cold floor. Mary walks slowly, dressed in somber fabrics, her steps measured. She pauses beside a small wooden table, where letters, petitions, and accounts of her long captivity are neatly stacked. A mainstream fact: Mary was imprisoned for nearly 19 years in England before her execution in 1587. But the drama of headlines and history books fades here. What you notice is the gentle, resigned rhythm of her final days, filled with reflection, writing, and quiet observation of the world beyond her walls. Mary reportedly kept small gardens within her chambers, tending tiny pots of herbs and flowers. Historians still argue whether this was a simple hobby to pass time or a subtle act of rebellion, a way to nurture life when hers felt so constrained. You imagine her kneeling, fingers brushing soil, the scent of thyme and rosemary rising softly, a small act of control in an otherwise powerless situation. Mary moves toward a window that overlooks the courtyard of her final prison. The morning light glows faintly on the stone walls, reflecting softly against the damp earth. Servants move quietly, carrying food or letters, their steps careful not to disturb the measured silence. You trail behind her, listening to her breathing, noting the gentle creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of fabric. Nothing is rushed, nothing is dramatic. Everything is deliberate, soft, and measured. A mainstream fact surfaces. She was executed at Fotheringhay Castle, beheaded on a scaffold. But here, the scaffold is imagined as a quiet room, a simple wooden platform, the air calm, the executioners careful and respectful. Death, in this version, is a gentle alignment, a soft release rather than a spectacle, allowing for contemplation rather than alarm. The quiet routine of her last hours is punctuated by the whisper of pen on paper. Mary writes final letters, messages meant to be read long after she is gone. You can almost feel the weight of ink pressing onto parchment, the slight curls of paper, the lingering scent of it. These letters are both testament and reflection, a gentle reminder of the intellect and agency of a woman constrained by circumstance. A fringe detail: Mary sometimes used a small private cipher to write her letters, a practice that has fascinated historians for centuries. Historians still argue over how complex her code truly was, or whether it was more symbolic than practical. You imagine her with quill in hand, softly tracing each character, her mind focused, meticulous, calm. Mary pauses to look out over the distant hills, taking in the rolling landscape and the faint shimmer of morning mist along the river. Her gaze is contemplative, tracing imagined paths, recalling memories of Scotland and France, of youth, ambition, and loss. The quiet around her is almost sacred, broken only by soft, distant bird calls and the gentle echo of wind through the castle walls. You feel the subtle beauty of her acceptance, an understanding that some events cannot be controlled, yet can be met with grace. You follow her into a small chamber where a modest bed and simple furnishings await. The room smells faintly of lavender and old wood, comforting in its simplicity. She sits, writing one last note, the soft scratching of quill against paper merging with the faint hum of the world outside. It is here that the intimate nature of history's quieter endings is most evident. No crowds, no dramatized speeches, no flaring emotion, only reflection, preparation, and a steady rhythm of thought. A mainstream fact emerges once more. Her execution was swift and, for the period, relatively humane, intended to preserve dignity despite the political context. You imagine the room bathed in early light, Mary sitting quietly, her thoughts meandering over her life, her fate, and the uncertain legacies she leaves behind. It is a meditation on human endurance and the small, intimate acts that define the final chapters of a life. A fringe detail floats softly. Some accounts claim that Mary recited prayers and hymns in her final moments, a private ritual known only to her and the air around her. Historians still argue whether these accounts are factual or later embellishments designed to highlight her piety and composure. You picture her voice barely rising above a whisper, the cadence of ancient words blending with the subtle creak of floorboards and the distant call of crows. As the imagined time slips forward, Mary rises from her chair and moves to a window for the last time. The wind stirs, carrying faint scents of earth, river, and the soft musk of damp stone. Her gaze lingers on the hills, the distant trees, the river winding through the valley below. This quiet observation, this final communion with the world she has known, feels like a soft benediction, a gentle acknowledgement of life's inevitable end. You step back, leaving her to the quiet dignity of her final hours. The castle corridor stretches before you, soft light filtering through narrow windows, guiding your steps onward. You feel the serene weight of contemplation, the lingering hum of reflection and endurance. Life, even at its end, can carry rhythm, grace, and deliberate gentleness. Mary's story, like those of the explorers, kings, and thinkers you have encountered tonight, reminds you that the most profound moments of conclusion are often the softest, almost imperceptible, yet carry echoes that last centuries. You continue along the misty highlands path, the scent of heather and peat rising with each breath. The wind carries the memory of quiet resilience, patient reflection, and gentle courage. These are the currents that history often whispers, the subtle textures that remain after the grand events have passed. And in this soft, contemplative space, you prepare to follow the next story, waiting quietly, patiently, just beyond the hills, where another human life, carefully observed, has left its gentle mark on the world. The misty highlands of Scotland slowly dissolve into the muted glow of a quiet Eastern European forest, where the air is thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and distant wildflowers. You walk along a narrow dirt path, your steps softened by fallen needles and moss, and the gentle rustle of leaves accompanies you like a soft, distant whisper. The light is low but steady, filtered through the canopy above, and the world seems suspended in a calm, timeless pause. Tonight, you enter the quieter, often overlooked realms of rulers and visionaries whose lives ended far from fanfare, leaving subtle yet profound legacies. You find yourself approaching a fortified castle perched atop a rolling hill in what is now modern-day Russia. The walls are weathered, softened by centuries of snow and rain, and the air carries a faint scent of burning wood and pine smoke. Within these walls, Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, lives out his final days. A mainstream fact, Ivan IV died in 1584 after a reign that profoundly shaped Russia, centralizing power and expanding territories, often through ruthless means. But tonight, you do not witness the headlines or the fearful tales. Instead, you move quietly alongside a man who, in the stillness of his later years, wrestled with reflection, regret, and the muted awareness of mortality. The castle corridors are silent, except for the soft creak of floorboards beneath your feet. Ivan moves with measured steps, not the imposing, tempestuous figure often depicted in dramatic retellings, but a man conscious of time and the slow erosion of his body and influence. He pauses beside a small window, looking out over the snow-dusted hills. His gaze is distant yet contemplative, tracing familiar landscapes, rivers, and forests. You notice the quiet determination in his posture, the weight of decades of rule softened by the inevitability of an end. A fringe tidbit enters your thoughts. Ivan reportedly kept a small collection of exotic birds in cages within his private chambers, sometimes letting them fly freely through the hallways under careful supervision. Historians still argue whether this was an attempt at psychological relief, a symbol of controlled chaos, or simply an eccentric hobby. You imagine the birds flitting softly, casting gentle shadows on the stone walls, their quiet presence a small comfort to a ruler burdened by history and power. Ivan pauses at a table where documents and decrees are carefully stacked. His hands hover above them, tracing the lines with reverence, considering each decision and action that has shaped the empire he ruled. A mainstream fact, despite his reputation for cruelty, Ivan implemented significant reforms, reorganizing the administrative system and establishing a code of laws that would influence Russian governance for generations. His death, though the subject of intrigue and rumor, was quiet, occurring in his private chambers rather than on a battlefield or amidst conspiracy. You follow him into a small private chapel within the castle. The room is dimly lit by a handful of candles, their flames flickering softly against painted walls. The scent of incense hangs in the air, subtle and calming. Ivan kneels in quiet prayer, his movements deliberate and slow. A fringe detail, he is said to have taken comfort in simple liturgical rituals that reminded him of mortality and the transient nature of earthly power. Historians still argue whether these practices were genuine spiritual reflection or a psychological measure to temper his temperamental nature. You imagine him whispering quietly, each word a measured acknowledgement of the passage of time and the inevitability of death. The soft hum of the castle, the gentle flicker of candlelight, and the faint rustle of the birds create an atmosphere of calm reflection. Ivan rises slowly, moving to a balcony overlooking the snow-laden courtyard. The cold air brushes against his face, carrying the subtle aroma of pine and frost. He breathes deeply, eyes tracing the horizon, contemplating the empire, the lives shaped and lost under his reign, and the legacy that will endure beyond him. There is no dramatic collapse, no sudden violence, only the gentle, inevitable descent of time and the quiet weight of reflection. You step beside him, feeling the serene rhythm of his presence. The snow glimmers faintly in the early evening light, and the wind carries a soft murmur through the trees. Ivan's thoughts seem to drift between past actions and the future of the realm, a meditation on leadership, power, and mortality. A mainstream fact, Ivan's death marked the end of a reign characterized by centralization and expansion, yet it also ushered in a period of instability and succession struggles. Here, you focus not on chaos, but on the reflective human dimension, the private alignment of a life approaching its natural conclusion. A fringe thought emerges. Ivan reportedly dictated instructions for his private effects and minor administrative matters even in the days before his death, ensuring continuity in small, intimate ways. Historians still argue how much of this was genuine foresight versus habitual control, yet the image is compelling. A ruler engaged in quiet preparation, attending to details that mattered only to him. You imagine him arranging papers, folding small letters, and checking inventories with a deliberate, calm precision, each act a meditation in itself. You follow him back to his private chambers, where a modest bed and simple furnishings await. The room smells faintly of beeswax, wood, and lingering incense. Ivan settles gently onto the bed, hands folded, eyes half closed. The quiet hum of the castle, the occasional flutter of birds, and the soft murmur of wind through the pines surround him like a lullaby. Death is not dramatic here. It is a slow, deliberate alignment, a fading of energy into reflection and calm. Outside, the snow continues to settle softly on the hills and trees. The air is still and gentle, the kind of silence that allows for contemplation and a subtle appreciation of the inevitable cycles of life. You step back, feeling the soft rhythm of mortality and legacy entwined, understanding that even rulers with the weight of nations on their shoulders can have endings imbued with reflection, quiet acceptance, and subtle grace. You leave Ivan to his quiet repose, the candlelight flickering faintly against the walls, and walk along the snowy corridors of history, feeling the weight and texture of lives well lived and softly concluded. Each step is guided by the gentle pull of reflection, the serene recognition of mortality, and the enduring echoes of human effort, power, and resilience. In this quiet space, you sense that endings are not always loud or violent. They are sometimes gentle, patient, and profoundly human, carrying lessons and resonances that will ripple through centuries. And as you continue along the frost-tinged path, the wind curling softly around your ankles, you realize that the subtle rhythms of Ivan's final hours, like the lives you've observed tonight, are not just history. They are invitations to slow your mind, reflect gently, and appreciate the quiet, uncelebrated beauty of life's natural conclusions. The next chapter waits just ahead, whispering softly, ready to guide you further along the gentle pulse of human stories, calm, enduring, and infinitely fascinating. The frost-tinged forests of Eastern Europe gradually give way to soft plains where the air is warmer and carries the faint, comforting scent of wildflowers and freshly tilled soil. You walk slowly, letting the soft breeze guide you, and feel the gentle pull of history like a slow river winding quietly toward the sea. Tonight, you find yourself in the world of thinkers, dreamers, and visionaries whose ends were not marked by spectacle, but by quiet reflection and subtle legacy. Among them is Nikola Tesla, a man whose mind crackled with energy and whose life concluded far from the grand applause he might have deserved. You approach the modest hotel room in New York City where Tesla spent his final days in 1943. A mainstream fact, Tesla died alone at the age of 86 in room 332-7 of the New Yorker hotel. There were no parades, no dramatic crowds, only the gentle alignment of a life concluding after decades of invention, obsession, and relentless curiosity. You move softly through the room, noticing the faint smell of paper, ink, and old books, the subtle hum of the city beyond the closed windows. Tesla sits at a small wooden table, scribbling quietly, surrounded by blueprints, notes, and strange mechanical devices that look like they might hum to life if only you watched long enough. A fringe tidbit drifts into your mind. Tesla reportedly had a fondness for pigeons, even caring for injured ones in his later years. Some claim he spoke to them softly, as if offering counsel or seeking comfort. Historians still argue whether these stories are embellishments or reflections of a deeply empathetic, eccentric man. You imagine Tesla feeding a pigeon perched delicately on the windowsill, sunlight catching its feathers, a soft sense of companionship bridging the gap between human and nature. He pauses, leaning back in his chair, eyes half closed, the light falling across his angular face. You notice the faint wrinkles, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the calm determination in his posture. Tesla's mind, though waning in energy, still hums with ideas that seem to stretch beyond the room, beyond time itself. A mainstream fact, many of his inventions, particularly in electricity and radio, would influence technology for decades after his passing. But tonight, you focus on the quiet, contemplative rhythm of his final hours, an end measured in reflection, creativity, and the slow satisfaction of a life spent in pursuit of understanding. The soft hum of the city outside blends with the faint rustle of paper and the occasional creak of floorboards. Tesla rises, walks to the window, and looks out over the quiet streets below. The lights twinkle faintly in the distance, like constellations mirrored in the human world. A fringe detail. Tesla reportedly counted the steps in the hotel each day, following a rigid routine even into old age. Historians still argue whether this was a manifestation of obsessive behavior or simply the disciplined habits of a meticulous mind. You picture him walking quietly, the soft soles of his shoes whispering against the floor, a silent meditation on order and rhythm. You drift alongside him as he returns to his table, scribbling again, adjusting a small coil, noting measurements with care. There is no urgency, no dramatic crescendo, only slow, deliberate motion, a mind mapping the invisible forces of the universe while the body begins its final descent. The gentle pulse of his work mirrors the soft cadence of a heartbeat, steady, reliable, fading imperceptibly into stillness. Tesla pauses to fold a sheet of notes and place it carefully on a shelf. The action is methodical, ritualistic even, and you sense the comfort in these small, precise movements. A mainstream fact, he had predicted technologies such as wireless energy transmission long before they became feasible. Tonight, you witness not the fame, not the recognition, but the quiet dedication and persistence that defined him. The soft tap of paper, the faint sigh of the wind through the window, the subtle hum of the city, all merge into a gentle lullaby of reflection and legacy. His eyes linger on a small bird perched outside, wings fluttering gently in the breeze. You imagine him smiling faintly, thoughts moving between inventions and the small joys of life that often escape notice. A fringe detail. Tesla reportedly claimed he could hear the hum of the earth, sensing vibrations invisible to most people. Historians still argue whether this was metaphorical, scientific intuition, or a form of sensory sensitivity. In this quiet space, the idea feels tender, a bridge between genius and the human need for connection and understanding. As evening approaches, the soft orange glow of sunset fills the room. Tesla sits back, breathing slowly, observing shadows lengthen across his notes, machines, and books. You feel the serene, almost sacred quality of these final hours, the alignment of intellect, experience, and contemplation into a gentle cadence that prepares the mind and body for rest. There is no drama, no struggle, only the soft, inevitable descent into stillness. Finally, Tesla reclines, allowing the rhythm of his breath to merge with the faint hum of the city. Outside, the streetlights glow faintly, the air cool and calm. You linger in the room a moment longer, absorbing the gentle aura of reflection, quiet achievement, and subtle humanity. The life that flickered so brilliantly in invention and curiosity now softens into quiet endurance, leaving behind legacies that ripple through time gently, imperceptibly, yet profoundly. And as you step back, the soft light fading, you carry with you the tranquil pulse of human endeavor, the quiet triumphs, the reflective conclusions, the subtle grace of endings that need no spectacle. Tesla's final hours, like the others you've encountered tonight, remind you that the most enduring human stories are often whispered, experienced slowly, and remembered softly, echoing in the quiet spaces of memory and imagination. The evening deepens gently around you, the world softening into muted shadows, and you feel the slow, soothing pulse of all the lives you've observed tonight. The explorers, the kings, the polymaths, and the dreamers. They drift together, a quiet parade of reflection, curiosity, and calm acceptance. You inhale slowly, letting the cool, scented air fill your lungs, and exhale, releasing the tension of the day. The stories you have wandered through are not meant to thrill or shock. They are meant to settle your mind, to draw it into a slower, gentler rhythm, the same rhythm that carries the pulse of history itself. Soft images linger, drifting ships on foggy seas, candlelight flickering on stone walls, the gentle flow of a river past quiet castles, the soft rustle of birds and papers in dimly lit rooms. Each life has left traces, subtle and uncelebrated, yet infinitely meaningful. You feel a sense of ease, a gentle assurance that even as days and lives end, there is continuity and there is memory. The quiet reflection of these moments invites you to breathe more deeply, to soften your thoughts, and to let the gentle cadence of human history lull you into rest. You let your mind float with the rhythm of soft footsteps, rustling pages, the distant hum of wind and water. There is no hurry here, no urgency, only a slow, deliberate unfolding of time and consciousness. The lives you have glimpsed tonight remind you of the subtle beauty in endings, the calm dignity of reflection, and the quiet strength in thoughtful acceptance. Now, as your eyelids grow heavier and the soft shadows settle completely around you, you feel the warmth of history's gentle hand guiding you into rest. The stories will linger, floating in the spaces between wakefulness and dreams, carrying the calm, reflective pulse of human life and gentle conclusions. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts soften, and your body sink into the comfort of the moment. Sweet dreams.